Mr. Lukashenko, hello, and thank you very much for being with RT. You've come to St. Petersburg to discuss further integration of Russia and Belarus with President Putin. Well, you know, earlier there was talk of single currency, single flag, single parliament, but now, less than 20 years on, it's kind of obvious that it's not really going to happen. Why have these large-scale plans have fallen through? What's tearing our countries apart?
You're absolutely right, except for one thing, when you say that it will never happen. Why? Historically, we came up with a treaty that saw the creation of the Union State of Belarus and Russia. Now, if you actually look it up, you'll see that it lays down a clear plan of action to build this union state, listing all the key elements needed, like the single currency and common institutions. Although it's a very detailed blueprint, we were also supposed to draft a new constitution and hold a referendum on it. However, we never did this last bit. There was no constitution or a referendum. Overall, we have made significant headway over the past years, although we have not been able to deliver on what was spelt out in the treaty. We have come to realize that perhaps we are not ready for it yet, that it's not the time. But there is still one great upside. Our joint efforts towards a union state led to the creation of a new organization, the Customs Union, which in its turn brought about a common economic space, and we are now working to transform it into the Eurasian Economic Union.
Well, would you agree with those analysts who say that it's an attempt to restore a mini version of the Soviet Union?
You can, of course, compare it to the Soviet Union or the European Union or any other union. But regardless of which one exactly you pick as a reference point, we can spot the trend. The world is seeing a global integration process, with new unions emerging across the planet. Take APEC, for example, or Mercosur in Latin America. I just returned from Venezuela. There are many more examples of this trend. New organizations emerge to survive in this competitive environment. Why shouldn't we use the positive experience of the Soviet Union in fostering our relationship?
Now, if we look beyond Russia, you were very close to Hugo Chavez. He was a man who united around himself leaders who challenged the West, the Western corporations, Western capital. Now that he's gone, what is the future of this alternative movement?
I would not say that Chavez united us simply because it's so difficult to do. I first realized that when we became part of the non-aligned movement. There are so many forces, including the United States, trying to win these non-aligned countries over to their side, to drive a wedge into the movement. Hugo Chavez worked hard to unite developing states. His contribution is really great, and I was lucky to have worked with him on this track. However, we have not been able to overcome these centrifugal forces, even in the non-aligned movement, due to various reasons. So I would not overestimate our efforts and say that we, and Hugo Chavez in particular, made huge progress in that area. Nevertheless, he shook up Latin America. Almost all the leaders there are left-wing, and they all came to pay their last respects to Chavez. This is a very clear proof of his legacy. He is gone, but he set it going. Latin America now boasts unique and strong leaders. Take Ecuador's Rafael Correa, for example. He is an economist, an intellectual, a very powerful personality. Take the women presidents in Brazil and Argentina. They are quite active too. I won't go as far as to say that this process has become irreversible, but it will impact the whole world, as well as Latin America. You can't just ignore it. Similar trends can now be observed in Africa, Asia and other regions. Of course, the contribution of Chavez was significant, but you shouldn't overestimate it. What I mean is that this movement for freedom, independence and justice will not wind down now that he's gone. No way. But of course, his role was essential.
Now, if we take a look at Venezuela, Chavez was not the only popular figure. There are one or two key opposition figures well known to the world. But in case of Belarus, it's only Lukashenko that the world knows. Sooner or later, you will have to hand over the power to somebody else, right? How will that happen?
To be honest, I never think in these terms. I swore that I will never hand over the power to my relatives, to my in-laws or children. It's out of the question. But the bottom line is that you need to win a fair election to get power. I remember that I won my first poll as an opposition candidate. It was a fair win, just like all the following elections where I've won. I've always played by the rules, and I want people who come to power after me to do the same, to win an election in a fair way.
So you're not preparing a successor for yourself?
To be honest, I've decided for myself that I will not even support anyone publicly. It must be conducted in a fair way. The people should elect their leader themselves when the time is right.
Well, I remember that during your summit visit to Venezuela, Chavez was still alive, and he said, "We have a great holiday today because our guest is the president of Belarus, Lukashenko, and his son." And then you told him that he was right in mentioning the boy because we need someone who will continue our case, someone we can pass the baton to 20 or 25 years from now, right?
I didn't say pass the baton, I said carry on our cause. I do remember it very well, and I said it in a very responsible way. When I say carry on, it doesn't mean he would just take the helm and go into the president's chair. We have 1 million boys like Lukashenko Jr., and it's them who will continue the cause which Lukashenko began some time ago. They will continue the work that I have been doing. Now here's what's on my record. Belarus has become a sovereign and an independent state. For the first time in our history, Belarus has retained its independence for 2 decades. This is the biggest accomplishment of the work done by my cabinet and I. We have created all the attributes of a state, except for a border with Russia. But we don't need it for the time being. Russia doesn't lay claim to our lands. We don't see it as a problem. Apart from that, all the major institutions and components that make a state are there. Many generations have grown up since, and more will grow up. Young people like Lukashenko Jr. will grow up. So there will be people who will continue our cause. Frankly, I didn't mean my son. He must be 35 to even qualify as a presidential candidate. So if you look 30 years from now, I'd be almost 90.
But if Nikolai wants to make a career in politics, will you support his choice?
He is free to choose his profession, but I wouldn't like him to become a politician. He's 8 now, and he's seen enough of his father's presidency. He's never had this idea that he will be president because his father was president. I never bring up this issue at home. That's not a topic to discuss with children. As for my grown-up sons, they're pretty straightforward about it. We've had enough of your presidency, they tell me, so we never talk of a power handover with them. And generally, I never talk about it anywhere else. Why should I? I'm still alive and kicking, so I think I can carry on for some time.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but I have here a quote of yours, and you said, "I'm horrified at the thought that the Belarusian wealth that I have toiled so hard to create and preserve would be auctioned off." Did you mean Belarusian assets would be sold off when you're gone?
Yes, that's something I am afraid of.
Does it mean that the system that you've set up is so fragile that it will collapse immediately after you're gone?
I didn't mean that Belarus would collapse as a state. What I meant was state property, the enterprises that underpin the economy, agriculture, which we have upgraded. And you have to go back to the time when I first became president. It was a time when we couldn't feed our own people. We had empty shelves, and there was no food on the table, as I say. Today, we have plenty of food for our people, and our prices are much lower than in Russia, Ukraine or the EU. Today, we export $5 billion worth of produce annually. We have invested a lot of money into 2 major upgrades in agriculture. So if new people in power decide to sell it off, Belarus will face disaster. I don't want our industrial enterprises or companies working in other sectors to be auctioned off for a penny. I would like Belarus to be run by a man who will not go to extremes, but would rather continue this cause. Domestic policy should be in line with the will of the people and the way of life which will emerge at that time, not only in Belarus, but in the whole world.
Tell me honestly, your political opponents, do you even take them seriously? For example, those who ran in 2010 for presidential election.
To be honest, I don't take them seriously. These elections revealed who they really are. So we had 10 alternative candidates. They only scored 1.5 to 2%. Well, that's their score. Okay, they might complain they were at a disadvantage. All right, let's say 5%. So how am I supposed to take them seriously if they come out and preach such nonsense that people don't even accept it? We didn't shut them down. They preached their ideas on air, even when they violated the constitution and called on everyone to take hay forks and crush the regime. Only 800 people came to the central square, and that included 400 permanent opposition activists. That's it. And then they really set out to crush the government building.
Well, you often say that democracy in Belarus is just as good as in America or Europe.
Absolutely. It's just as good, trust me. I can prove it right here, right now, that there is no dictatorship in Belarus. Shall I? Very simply, in just a few words. This is the argument I use to convince my Western partners. In order to be a dictator like Stalin, one has to have the resources. Resources are paramount. You need to understand that. Do I have any nuclear weapons? Exactly, I do not. Do I have as much oil as Hugo Chavez did in Venezuela? No. Do I have as much natural gas as Russia? None at all. And so on and so forth. Do I have so many people as China does? 1.5 billion people? No. In order to be a dictator and dictate one's will, one has to have the resources, economic, social, military, population, and so on. But we have none. And I am being objective about it. I am telling you that we have no claims of global importance and don't see ourselves solving major global problems. We don't have the resources to do so. What we want to do is find our place in the sun and live as an average, civilized European state. That's all I want.
Well, if that's the case, how come no other significant political figure has emerged on the political scene in Belarus over the last 19 years?
That's probably because the current leader is strong enough and you don't see any others in his shadow. I don't want to sound immodest, but this question is not for me to answer. Of course, we have what you call the opposition. I call them the fifth column because they work for the benefit of someone other than their own country, and they promote the agenda of those who finance them. Is that acceptable? What kind of people would support such opposition? But you shouldn't worry, the time will come and we'll have new leaders.
Mr. President, you know the list of things the European Union holds against you, so I'm not going to repeat it.
You can if you like, I don't mind, though I do know them very well. That's certainly true.
And so does everyone. Lack of political pluralism, freedom of speech, and so on and so forth. And it's a long list. But what I would like to ask you is, why do you think you're persona non grata there?
You know, I visited Venezuela recently, and I had some time to think. I did some reading, analysed things, and I thought of it as if I were debating with the Americans and the West in general. So I say, all right, Lukashenko is persona non grata for you, and you deny him entry. But you also deny entry to both my elder sons and to even my youngest, who is just a little boy. What wrong could he have done? Does he have anything to do with the alleged rigging of elections? All of my children are completely excluded from the election process. How can they possibly just label them whatever it is they labelled them? Something bad, obviously, and simply ban them from the European Union. If they care about human rights, why do they abuse the human rights of my citizens? I can understand why they don't want to put up with Lukashenko. I can tell you the reason why they don't. It's not because I'm an authoritarian leader, although that may be true. And it's not because they call me a dictator. Well, they used to. No one has been calling me an authoritarian or a dictator for a while. They used to call me that because they had been instructed to do so by the US.
So why then, really?
Are you asking why me? Well, you know, when the new state of Belarus appeared on the map and claimed a place in the sun, just like Georgia and other newly formed states, those who'd already been there didn't like it, as they wanted that place in the sun for themselves. And now they had to move over, and some were unhappy about it. But that's not the real problem. Then it starts to go from bad to worse. Lukashenko decides to take a hard stand for the state's independence. While everyone wants a piece of what Belarus has to offer in terms of the economy, they didn't like me taking a stand, and so they started calling me all sorts of things. Next, we do not choose the track of building a capitalist market-driven economy where everything works around private property and you have to sell out the state's property into private ownership to make it work. We don't do that. We don't privatize everything, and some are unhappy about that. We are a welfare state with a strong social policy. The social and economic policies I pursue are very different from what the West would want us to have. Next,
we do have a rigorous political system that wouldn't allow things like a fist fight in Parliament.
When power is divided between entities like the Parliament and the government, the President ends up with no power. And it's easy then to manipulate what happens in the state. You can stage fights and conflicts. This will backlash on the people. And behind all this, you can lay your hands on some valuable assets through privatizing before anyone knows. And so they don't like it, that they can't do it. As for freedom of speech, pluralism and other such things, that can't be serious. How is it even possible not to have them with all the modern media around us? There is no way, for instance, that Russia Today is a channel I have any influence on. If you like it, you can watch it. Anyone can. And there is also the internet. Our analysts have calculated that 51% of our active population are active internet users. How can I possibly keep their mouths shut? I am more than anyone opposed to bans, building fences and other such things. You can win the fight if you stay strong. If you are weak, you better stay out of the fight, because you're only going to get yourself and your state chased into a corner. I don't want to sound like I'm being overconfident, but I just want to say again, I feel strong enough to fight and stand up to any attacks on me, my family and my state, my Belarus.
Speaking of which, 2 years ago you said Germany and Poland had conspired against Belarus. What conspiracy did you mean, and what do they want from Belarus?
I do remember it was right before the election. The German foreign minister came to visit. It was a high-profile visit. As for Poland...
Was it when the foreign minister was offended by your comment regarding his sexual orientation?
Right, on his being gay. But why take it hard, if that's what you are?
Did you know he was gay when you were talking to him?
No, I didn't. I had no idea at the time. My staff included it in the memo, but I didn't finish reading it.
But why did you even bring up the subject?
I didn't. They did. Sikorsky did. And I simply responded. He kept asking questions like, Moscow banned the gay pride parade. Would you ban it if your people wanted one? I replied, you know, I probably wouldn't let them do it downtown. I'd have them parade somewhere on the outskirts. Let other people watch, maybe say something. I basically don't mind lesbians. But I definitely do mind the gays. Why? Because women turn gay only when we, the guys, are not good enough.
And what did he have to say about that?
They didn't say anything. They just listened. I didn't even see the look on their faces. The scandal broke out after they left. My foreign minister told me right after, Mr. Lukashenko, you would have done better not to talk about that. And why is that? I asked. And he said, because he's one of them. And I said, why didn't you tell me earlier? He said, I sent you a memo. I just never finished reading it.
Did you think it helped during the relationship between Germany and Belarus?
It wasn't about that. They had previously approached me with basically a list of terms and conditions of the kind, we'll be friends with you if you do this, and that, and that, and that. And I responded, I can do this, and this, and that. I did most of the things they had required, and that's exactly what I call them, their requirements. But they did nothing in return. They simply found an excuse to talk themselves out of it. The excuse being that incident when we dispersed that crowd of 400 people who tried to break into the government building. There were a total of 800 people, 400 ran away, and the other 400 stayed and tried to take out the doors at the entrance. This was broadcast live. How would any other country respond to that? We didn't do anything like pour water on them on this cold day, December 19th. We didn't use tear gas, we didn't shell them or shoot rubber bullets at them, as they do in EU countries. We simply took measures to protect our government building. And they used it as an excuse to talk themselves out of keeping the promises they had given me. That's what it was about, and nothing else.
You mentioned a few times at the start that you were previously called Europe's last dictator. I looked through a lot of material, listened to many interviews with you, and I can say that 99% of those materials have a lead-in with word combination Europe's last dictator in them. You mentioned it yourself. Are you being ironic about it?
Exactly. I can tell you how I did it. I am to be interviewed by a Western journalist, and all that person knows about me is what you just mentioned. All these things that are published. The Lukashenko is a dictator, and even though he probably doesn't eat people alive, he definitely eats women. So here they come for the interview, sit quietly opposite me, and mention in passing the dictatorship thing, sort of low-key. But what I always did was bring it up and talk openly about it. I would tell them, all right, I'm being referred to as a dictator. I have quite an autocratic leadership style, which is defined by the system. Have you ever given it a thought why I chose this style and built this kind of system? Wouldn't you think that there were probably some good reasons for it? Could you perhaps try and see a good, solid reason behind it? You see, no one has ever tried to look at it this way. No one tried to understand why this very particular person has built such a strong, autocratic system, which at the very least yields results, by the way. So, as for dictatorship, I say to them, you're very lucky to meet Europe's last dictator, alive, in person. Remember it, as that's something you probably won't see again. That's the kind of irony I used.
But honestly, do you not care at all what the West and the United States have to say about you?
No. In fact, I do care.
Well, because it's not just about you, it inevitably affects the country's image.
Right you are, and you just said it correctly. If it were only about me, I would probably get hurt and say, to hell with them. But the thing is, through that, they are trying to hurt the entire nation, the state. So I can't say I don't care at all. Although I should say, I am not taking it too much to heart anymore when they say dictator, dictator. I feel sorry for those who actually believe it when they say it, as they don't even know that they are deluded about the reality and the person they're talking about. That's the only thing I really feel bad about.
What happened to Lord Bell, man that you've hired to help improve the image of Belarus in the international community?
It's not the way it's being presented. I won't go into all the details about Lord Bell. He was recommended, by the way. I am adamantly against the idea. Although many do it, they try to improve their image with the help of PR people. So it was the first and only time I agreed to meet a person who does some kind of work writing things, and I never even went into detail as to what exactly he does. Because we never paid him, and he never charged us. All he said was that he wanted to talk and write something. As to the word that got out that it had to do with image promotion, that probably came from him or someone else, and it was then misrepresented, as if President Lukashenko had invited him to help push the country onto the right development track and fix its image.
So he was making a hard sell.
I don't know. Either he or someone else behind him. I don't even believe in the idea of someone coming over and changing your image just like that. That's not something you can do overnight. It takes more than a month or even a year. Changing your image takes a very long time. Changing your image also takes more than just changing what others say about you. That's certainly important. But the key here are the things you do, the actions you take. And that's something that can't be changed overnight.
Well, you know what else they say about the story with Lord Bell? That he was actually introduced to you by Berezovsky. Is that true?
Berezovsky didn't introduce us. Lord Bell arrived on his own. But it's true that Berezovsky was among those people who recommended him. So there's a bit of truth in that.
A few days ago, Director of U.S. National Intelligence presented a report forecasting a possible new crisis for Belarus in 2013. Would you agree with this assessment?
Why not say the same about America? I could put it this way. The global community, including Belarus, may face a new economic crisis if it comes from its usual place of origin, i.e. the United States. The fact remains that Europe has failed financially, that's true. And since Europe accounts for half of our export turnover, it's obvious that it's going to affect our economy. Our export turnover with Russia is also declining a little bit, although there's no crisis as such in Russia yet. And so it's true even more so for Georgia, Belarus, Ukraine and other states with the kind of real sectors of economy they have, with no oil and gas of their own, and the need to pay high prices for them. Of course, it's a problem for us when the entire world's economy is going down, but we have some reserves of our own, and we'll use them if the need arises. We'll make it.
Well, it's just that during the last crisis, you resorted to requesting aid from the IMF. For example, Chavez, he cut all ties with IMF and the World Bank.
And that was the right thing to do. He had enough resources. He had the world's biggest oil deposits, ample natural resources. He had all the reserves he needed. Why take loans and pay off interest?
But he requested aid from China.
He did ask China. Maybe he did it for ideological reasons, and China offered to help, but obviously for a profit. China is probably Venezuela's #1 investor, and they invest in the sectors of economy they're interested in, such as gold and oil.
So was IMF your last choice, and you just couldn't help it? It's just because they're imposing some political terms on Belarus that you do not welcome.
That's correct. Although that wasn't about the political terms, it was about the tough economic terms they gave us, but we managed to comply. And overall, they were right to do it. Of course, it was tough on us, but they in fact required us to implement the same measures we actually had to take up anyway, and had already started implementing. When you run out of money, what sense does it make to increase spending on welfare and benefits, to keep inefficient businesses running, and so on and so forth? But their approach was just to cut it all down. Ours was that it's about the people involved and that we can't do it to them so abruptly. So basically what they required was the same as what we did anyway. The only difference was they wanted to do it right away, while we were taking a steady approach. And by the way, the US supported our application for the loans. Without their involvement, the IMF wouldn't have given approval. We successfully delivered on all the requirements and are now paying off the debt. And we took the cheapest loans possible, so I cannot really tell you anything else about that. Chavez probably refused to take loans because he had plenty of resources at hand, and he probably also got loans in exchange for some future profits and benefits he could offer.
Thank you very much for this interview, sir.
Please don't call me sir. I am no lord. It takes too much money to become one.
Mr. Lukashenko, thank you very much for the interview.
My thanks to you for coming over to have a talk.